Kathy might not remember everything, but what she does remember is pretty strange. And in this chapter, it gets stranger because we're going to learn about the people who run Hailsham Boarding School. Welcome to Chapter by Chapter. Kathy starts out the chapter by theorizing that because she is soon going to be leaving the position of being a carer, she has these old memories sort of bubbling up to the surface. And one of the memories that she mentions in this chapter is the tokens controversy. Basically, the tokens controversy is that the students decide that they should be getting tokens for the artwork taken for the gallery. Now, I find this interesting because the gallery isn't even expressly talked about at this school. It's just kind of whispered, but everyone realizes it's a thing without ever explicitly talking about it. So this is a big deal for the students to get the urge, or the confidence at least, to approach the headmaster and the other guardians about receiving compensation for their work for the gallery. Because remember, the work that gets into the gallery is the best of the best, which means it could have very well sold really well at the exchange, which would then give them money for the sales. Now, we haven't talked a whole lot about the sales, but basically this is when goods from the outside of the school come in and when students can use their tokens to buy them to either add to their collections, which is a little chest where they keep all their precious items, or to just kind of show off and wear and express their personality with. I think this is really interesting, this idea of the sales, because it shows us just how isolated Hailsham is, and we'll get into that further in other chapters, but not a lot of goods from the outside world get in. So it's a big deal when there is a sale, and it's a big deal then to have these tokens. So the students decide that they're going to approach the headmaster, Miss Emily, and petition to get more tokens for their sale. So if you were ever in school and you tried to petition for something, get administration to change their stance on a policy, this is sort of what the students are doing at this moment. And we learn a lot about administration at this school, specifically Miss Emily, because of the reaction to not only the token controversy, but also the sales themselves. One of the really interesting sections of this chapter for me is when Kathy and Ruth are reflecting back on Miss Emily and how she ran the school from Ruth's hospital room in Dover when they're in their 20s. So they're thinking back at it, and Kathy says that basically she thinks Miss Emily had some pretty odd behavior, saying that sometimes she would be seen wandering around Hailsham in a dream, talking to herself. But Ruth takes offense to this, and she says she was never like that. How could Hailsham have been the way it was if the person in charge had been potty? And potty is slang for slightly insane or eccentric. Miss Emily had an intellect you could slice logs with. So Kathy and Ruth have this disagreement on how exactly to remember Miss Emily. And based on the details we get of their past there, this sort of lack of consensus makes sense. Take, for instance, the token controversy. Miss Emily decides that the students should get some compensation for their work for the gallery. That seems like a very generous person. But if someone misbehaves at a sale, if they fight over the same item, think like Black Friday shopping in the United States, if they get too intense over it, Miss Emily might have a 30-minute assembly where they all have to stand and listen to her lecture them about their behavior, an assembly that both Kathy and Ruth agree doesn't really make sense. Furthermore, she has a real unpredictability based on how she doles out punishments. We're told that sometimes she snaps at a student and sometimes she lets things go, which is, from a teacher's perspective here, which just simply happens. You don't always punish situations the exact same because you're a human and not a robot. You try and be as fair as possible, but it's not always possible. This is all fine and good, but there's some other really interesting situations. One is when Kathy is reflecting back to a time when she was walking down a path that maybe she should not have been walking down, and she looks into an empty classroom and sees Miss Emily in it. I want to read this for you. Kathy says, "As usual, I was glancing into the empty rooms as I went past, and then suddenly I was looking into a classroom with Miss Emily in it. She was alone, pacing slowly, talking under her breath, pointing and directing remarks to an invisible audience in the room. I assumed she was rehearsing a lesson or maybe one of her assembly talks, and I was about to hurry past before she spotted me. But just then she turned and looked straight at me. I froze, thinking I was for it. But then I noticed she was carrying on as before, except now she was mouthing her address at me. Then, naturally as you like, she turned away to fix her gaze on some other imaginary student in another part of the room. I crept away along the path, and for the next day or so kept dreading what Miss Emily would say when she saw me, but she never mentioned it at all. I don't know about you, but there's just something kind of off-putting about that passage, almost creepy, the way that Miss Emily is described. And I think the easiest way to interpret it, at least for me, is that Miss Emily is someone who is probably very well suited for her job, but is under a tremendous amount of stress, and her behavior is quite potty, as they say in the novel, from time to time. One last thing about Miss Emily I want you to consider is, why do Ruth and Kathy care so much about how she's remembered? And my thought on that is this. They debate on how to remember Miss Emily because Miss Emily represents so much of Hailsham, which represents so much of them. There seems to be a real significance on how they are remembered. And of course, the chapter ends with more information on Ruth, both the influence that she wielded and some of her insecurities, which we're going to get into more in chapter 5. One final note is I want you to pay attention to how the chapter ends. We learn a little bit about the secret guard, and chapter 5 tells us a lot about what exactly the secret guard is. But I think it's really interesting to point out just stylistically here how Ishiguro sets up one chapter to the next and how it can seem almost obvious. Secret guard, now we're going to talk about secret guard. Lost tape, now we're going to talk about lost tape. But underneath the obvious is some really interesting details that if you've read the novel more than once, kind of jump out at you. So if you see something that seems out of place, like Miss Emily's behavior in the classroom, annotate it, write it down, take a note of it. Because as we get closer and closer to the end, these details are going to become more and more significant. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you're enjoying it. Chapter 5 is where I, on my first read, really dove into the book and was like, I need to finish reading this as fast as possible. So if you're just barely hanging in there, if people reflecting on their early childhood years at an elite boarding school isn't your thing, chapter 5 is where I think it really picks up. So I hope to see you then, and happy reading.